Hello, I'm Kristen Fisher Ratan. I'm with the Public Library of Science, and I'd like to be Princess Leia. Does that work for everyone? Be a good look. So most of you obviously are familiar with PLOS. We like to call ourselves Born Open Access. And I recently was reading this book. It's called 2312. It takes place several centuries in the future after a whole crisis of climate change has decimated the planet and people have to rebuild and all sorts of things have happened. And it has as part of the book an internal history lesson essentially. And there are these eras that they discuss. And the first era is the dithering. And this is the era basically from now until 2060, when everyone knew what was going on and everyone knew what was happening, but no one did anything about it. And then this was followed by the crisis where all the really bad things happened. Now, I'm not saying that the onslaught of open access is, in fact, an apocalyptic climate change. I actually think it's a good thing, myself. But I can understand how it might feel that way sometimes to people. And I would suggest that, instead of having an era of dithering, we actually work proactively together to figure out how to make the transition work for everyone. One of the things that really hit me when I was reading this book was how future generations felt about the people who were dithering, how they despised the generations of the dithering who had heedlessly pushed the climate into a change with an unstoppable momentum. And I just would like, personally, to feel that the successors in publishing look back on this period of time as a time when, in fact, we've done the opposite. So policy. What I think is really interesting about what's happening right now, and I agree with David Crotty on this, is it's actually the argument's been taken out of our hands. It doesn't really matter so much how you feel about open access, how it makes you feel, and whether or not you're on Luke Skywalker's side or Darth Vader's side. It's all really being handled at levels above us. This is a slide that shows the growth of open access archiving, the mandates, and you'll see that blue period, that section in the middle there is institutional mandates, and that's by far the largest area of growth. But what I think is the most significant is the funder, which is in red there, and that leap at the end there in 2013, I think is very significant. And it'll be interesting to track this trend to see if that continues, but it should be telling all of us something. And obviously the U.S. efforts that Michael's describing, and those in the UK that have already been discussed earlier by Stephen, and I'm not going to go into detail on all of those, but they're representative because this is actually happening globally. There are more mandates all around the world, and there are more universities adopting policies. And this is a slide showing where all of these different efforts are happening. And we're just seeing a huge amount of growth. Obviously, North America and Europe are the centers here, but there's a lot of efforts around mandates or actual mandates being put in place globally. So I used to say when I first took this job at PLOS a couple years ago that open access was the new black. But I don't think it's actually a fashion choice anymore. It's really a mandate, increasingly. And so, again, regardless of whether or not you might think it's a good idea or maybe it's actually incredibly difficult to contemplate doing it, I think we all have to start to come up with strategies to help out to make sure that it's a viable alternative for various different publishing types. I actually had dinner with Dame Janet Finch in the UK last December. It was a PLOS event, and she and I sat across from each other during the reception and dinner that followed. And I said something about how the efforts in the UK, the RCUK policy, and the efforts coming out of the Finch report were going to be difficult even for PLOS and a born OA publisher to do because, actually, as our friends from CCC and EBSCO pointed out, it's hard. The plumbing is tricky. It's going to take a lot to get the data to work. It's actually going to be really difficult. And she basically told me to stop whining. She said, we don't care whether any individual publisher survives this, even PLOS. I was kind of like, oh, well, alrighty, I'll be quiet and go back to my wine. But it's an interesting wake-up call, which is that we have to figure out how to adapt and survive. Nobody's going to do that for us. Nobody's going to cushion it. So what is open access? The Bethesda Principles from 2003, free, unrestricted, author retains rights to attribution, and immediately deposited. Those are the basic core tenets of what open access means. And I think there's a lot of confusion because there are a lot of things that it's not. It tells you about how the content is being disseminated, whether or not it can be reused, and whether the article is archived. It's fairly simple. It's not telling you about what the scope of the journal is, the quality of the journal, its language, and then what sort of review, editorial processes, and acceptance criteria the journal has. These vary widely across open access journals. And it certainly doesn't tell you the business model. And this is where I think it gets interesting. Right now, PLOS uses a gold OA model, APCs. PeerJ, peek in the back, uses a different model, a membership model. There's room for a lot of experimentation in how we actually do this, and I think we're at the very, very earliest stages of that. So I think it's premature to jump to conclusions about how the shift to open access is going to affect our economy and affect everybody's revenues. I think, in fact, forcing it a little bit will create more opportunities for creative thinking. PLOS put together a how open is it sort of brochure. It looks at what are the 6 components that define open access publishing. Basically came to the conclusion that it's a continuum. It's not just an either or. And you can see this online. I think it's on the PLOS site as well as the Spark site, and take a look at that and figure out kind of where you fall on this, where you want to fall on this continuum. But we certainly can agree that there is a lot of momentum right now in open access publishing. This slide shows sort of where the top open access volume-wise publishing numbers are going, and obviously going way up. I recently heard from Cameron Nallen, our Director of Advocacy, that the top open access publishers represent about 10% of the scholarly literature today, and that's obviously growing at an exponential rate. So it's a lot of content and a lot of market share. The number of individual journals is growing significantly too. We're now up to 8,817, according to the DOAJ. And that number that represents a significant trend, rising trend over time. So people are making it work. A lot of people are making it work. And I think, again, there'll be a lot of opportunity to experiment with how. I apologize for all the scribbling on the side. This wasn't mine. If I had done it, these would have been very neat little lines. I'm kind of obsessive about things like that, as Princess Leia should be. But if you look at the different categories here, the bottom is subscription journals with an online open access content. The middle layer is online-only journals with no APC, and the top is online-only journals with an APC. And you'll see that that top layer, what we would think about essentially as gold OA, is rapidly growing area. So that's it's building the proportion. So PLOS One and the rise of the mega journal. PLOS's success is largely predicated, obviously, on the growth of PLOS One, which has been significant and continues to be pretty extraordinary, actually. And it's, at this case, I think at this point it's fairly safe to say that open access, as we're defining it today, succeeds best with scale. So for those of you not familiar, PLOS One is it's differentiated largely by its editorial criteria, its acceptance criteria. It's based on whether or not the article is scientifically sound, ethical, properly reported, and whether the data support the conclusions. And so we're not rejecting based on impact or excitement factor, or whether or not we think someone who's reading PLOS One would be interested in this. So we don't have a scope limitation there. We also don't have a size limitation. We'll publish as many articles as we can. That being said, we do still have about a 35% rejection rate, I would say, in PLOS One. So that's still indicative that there's a fair amount of papers out there that at least PLOS One's academic editors do not feel yet worthy for publication. So the growth has been pretty extraordinary, and I think it's probably the single biggest story about PLOS and maybe about open access publishing in general, is that it's interesting to see how researchers, authors, are really sort of voting with their feet here. There's a lot of discussion of whether they want to be told to publish open access, whether they like or don't like the CC BY license and all of that, but what we're finding is they want to publish with us. So my guess is that we'll continue to see that trend across all of the other open access publications out there. And I think the question of whether or not a lot of these other efforts are going to succeed is just too soon to say. If you saw that graph back there, things start slow. They do, for any new publication. Anyone who's started a journal knows that's the case. So I think it's way too early to think that the growth of these other journals won't end up looking just like PLOS ones. So what are your options if you're interested in open access? I mean, really, it's about launching something new, flipping an existing journal, deciding that you're going to take the megajournal approach and maybe create a single megajournal that sits underneath your more selective journals, or to go with the hybrid approach if you must. But I do think the hybrid journals are going to get increasing pressure. So one option may be to say, think of that as a transitional option. Set a goal for when you think your hybrid will be fully OA and work towards it. But I think what's most interesting is these same people who are saying, we want you to publish content OA, they're also saying a lot of other things. And I think it's a really good idea to begin to listen to those other things, because from PLOS's perspective, the OA argument's kind of done. We're moving on. What's the next thing? What are we going to be looking at, and what do we have to do next? And Michael mentioned data. It's central to everything that we're thinking about now. But there are quite a few things out there that I think we should all be considering. And I think of them as the 7 virtues. Open access, check. Speed. We all have to get faster. The time it takes to get from the time when an author feels that their article is relatively good to the time that it actually gets published is extraordinarily long. We need to make the content smarter. We need to think about wider distribution, reproducibility, engagement, and reporting. And instead, a lot of people are spending a lot of time in endless revision cycles. We at PLOS, we're absolutely one of the worst at dumbing down content and turning things into image files TIFFs that shouldn't have been. People are hoarding data instead of sharing data, or making it, just not asking for it, and frankly losing it. We did a study of PLOS biology authors from, I think it was 2004 to 2006 or something, so several years in the past. And I think a very small percentage of them, I can't remember the exact number, could actually locate the data, the real data, the data sets from which they wrote their articles. A lot was lost. And they felt maybe they could find it, maybe. So let's talk through these quickly. Let's see how I'm doing on time here. So don't restrict the flow. Obviously, open access, freely available, publishing anything that's good science. It's fine, I think, to have a selective journal, but offering options for rapid publication in another venue soon afterwards makes a lot of sense, and it's going to make a lot of sense to authors. They're getting tired of it. Publish early. Be open to micro-publications. It doesn't have to be a fully baked article to be useful. We want to offer channels to people. At PLOS, we're trying to do this, but in addition, I think it should be ubiquitous to offer opportunities for people to get pieces of information and research, assumptions, early data findings out there as quickly as possible. Label them for what they are, caveat them, but get them out there and shared. Shepherd the papers rapidly. We need to improve turnaround times. Again, mea culpa. We have some long ones as well. Improving the peer review process, the transparency of it, and leveraging technology. There's been some discussion about lowering the cost of publishing. I think we can all lower the cost of publishing. Personally, I think we have a huge opportunity to do so, and I think that a lot of it's in the technology. Smart content. How do we tell the story in more useful and interesting ways using new media, offering the context and the background of the paper? It's interesting that some of our authors have blogs about their article, sort of the making of, and they tend to get more hits than the article itself. So people are actually really interested in the background. They're interested in the context, the story behind it. Or what happens afterwards. One idea I have is throwing up a little spot that the author can edit on the article page to tell what's happened since then, point people to new research, make amendments, say oops, whatever they need to do. Publishing negative results, PLOS One does that, and actually there are some funders now who are going to mandate the publishing of negative results. So offering channels for people to do that, and perhaps in conjunction with papers that they're publishing with positive findings. And then, of course, enriching the article, making the content more useful, making the data findable. I think it's important to improve the portability and granularity of content. The article, I think we've all heard over and over, as is a container that's not terribly useful. What can we do to deconstruct it once it's been constructed? One of the things we've done at PLOS is make sure that all the figures have very rich metadata, and all of them are in Figshare. And then locks, of course. Not just the locks we all know and love, but that idea that putting the content in many places is a good thing, that it's actually better. And even though you may feel the fear of losing usage, if your content is used more, you are more relevant, you are more useful, and therefore people will want to keep giving you their money. Reproducibility. So this is a big hot button at the moment, and it involves making sure that the data are discoverable, that they're out there, that they're in repositories, they're not hidden. And there's a lot of work that needs to be done, obviously by Michael, to make this happen, and it's not the publisher's job to make it all happen, but there are a lot of things that we can do to improve the opportunities, improve the uptake by authors. We have data policies and data mandates that are just completely ignored by our authors. So I know it's a tough thing to do, but I think there are a lot of efforts that we can do. Making the data within the articles more useful. I love RUP's figure viewer. It's great. We need more of that kind of thing. How can people actually work with the information within the article? Ways to mine the content, more opportunities to mine the content. All of our content is open access, and yet PLOS, we don't make it that easy actually to do, because it's an extra added step for us. It's an expense, and we're busy and we're growing and all of that, but there's a lot that we could do to actually make the content more available, even if it is behind a paywall. And then tools for reusing. How do you give people the tools to really remix the content? Again, we're sitting on a mountain of content, but we're not seeing it all being reused in educational settings as much as it could be. And that's, again, largely because it's not terribly portable or granular or marked up. How can we encourage engagement? PLOS really tried to do a lot with commenting, and we have a lot of empty comment fields. It's sad, but I'd say that's partly because we didn't necessarily implement it as beautifully as one might do today, but it's also because people are not necessarily incentivized to do that. It's not something that's part of the research, the average researcher's workday. But they are making comments and having discussions around content elsewhere. So how can we bring that in and import and export that information into all of the right places and kind of create that fabric that Tim O'Reilly was talking about yesterday, which is naturally happening as the web evolves. And then how can we actually build on identity? I mean, reputation is the currency of the realm in academia, and we're not necessarily connecting engagement with our content with reputation. And if we can find ways to do that, I think we'll find that we get a lot more engagement. And then finally, metrics. And who knew that metrics would suddenly get sexy? I mean, it's great. But article-level metrics are quite the fad now, and they should be. They're amazing. But also, what about sub-article-level metrics? How about looking at how many times a figure was opened? I think an author would be fascinated to know which figures people were reading within the article, and understanding what was being done with that content. And then beyond the article, there's actually technology now that can tell when something's been cut and pasted and where it's ended up. That's great. Let's find out how the bits and pieces that are currently contained within an article actually end up being disseminated further out. So what happens if we don't do it right? Scientists are kind of doing it for themselves right now. So I was on a panel with this guy, Anthony, and he's got this amazing open blog, lab notebook kind of thing, and he puts everything up there. It's kind of too much information, but there's a huge amount of really rich information, and he's sharing it all well before publication. He's not at all concerned about whether or not that would inhibit his ability to publish. He doesn't care. His advisor doesn't care. Actually, PLOS wouldn't either. I told him, send it to us. But I just think it's a fascinating trend, and there are more and more of these cropping up. And what's interesting is how much engagement he's getting. So he's actually getting a lot of that engagement. He has a huge following of people following his research, a lot of comments on his open lab notebook, and he's created an exciting and dynamic community around it. Figshare. A lot of people have put in their data and their information up on sites like Figshare well before they get to the point of publishing. And this is kind of natural for the younger generations to just share like this and put it out there. The concept that they need to keep it private is a little more foreign to them than it was to older generations of researchers. And we should be considering that and changing the way in which we think about the publishing model to fit those expectations. And then finally, citizen science. This stuff is cropping up everywhere as well. So there's this is Zooniverse, which is, basically a crowdsourced astronomy thing. I was about to say astrology, that would have been bad. And they've actually discovered whole new galaxies with citizen science. There are bird-watching ones. There are all kinds of really interesting ones. People are crowdsourcing science. And if you start to think about science being done this way, what's the role for the publication in all of that? Especially if reputation begins to be addressed elsewhere. If reputation is one of the main reasons why people publish, and that begins to be addressed in these other realms, and that begins to, those sorts of reputation building activities begin to be recognized on tenure and promotion committees, what is the role for publishers? How do we remain relevant? And I think we need to consider that. So I'd say that's all what goes beyond open access. So hurry up and get the open access part done so we can talk about all this other stuff, because that's really the cool stuff. Thank you very much.